What are the two most aggressively fought over categories in society today? Religion and politics. And I do not believe for an instant that the main reason it is so controversial in our society today is because for generations we were just told never to talk about it. And it's really simple because if you start with the wrong perspective, you'll make the wrong choice. I'm not out to hurt anyone's feelings, but between politically correct or correct, I'll choose the last. Hello again, and welcome to the Chris F. Walker Podcast. I am Chris F. Walker. Thank you so much for joining me today. Today is episode 9 of our podcast series, and today is an interesting topic of discussion because there's going to definitely be some both sides to this one. We're going to talk today about bad language. And this is a fun topic to get into. If you've ever been to my blog, I encourage you, by all means, go check it out at chrisfwalker.com. I did a write-up on this one, very similar to what we're going to be talking about today. But what I want to talk about with bad language is I want to really kind of dive into what it means to use bad language or offensive language or to be cursing. And as we start identifying what each of these titles really mean, then it starts opening up a little bit more dialogue for how we use them correctly or incorrectly in our conversations with other people. And see, the first stage that I've always tried to take whenever I talk about this topic is I try to remind everyone that I am never on the side of offending anyone. Offending someone on purpose is really just kind of a mean play. But there are certain topics of discussion that are going to be found offensive. And that one becomes a little bit more tricky because how do we address these kinds of topics when ultimately we know they're going to cause controversy or we know they're going to cause conflict? And it's not always very easy to open up the dialogue for a lot of these areas. In fact, most of the time what we see today is people say that in order to be polite, you actually have to avoid all of those altogether. Meaning, in order to be polite, you can never be offensive to anyone ever. And I'm not sure if I agree with that context. Because, don't get me wrong, I was raised by a single mother and she did an amazing job to accomplish a lot with very little. And she's honestly still to this day one of my role models for what she was able to accomplish without the help of another parent. And we were living far away from most families, so we didn't really have a lot of aunts and uncles or cousins. It was just her, and she pulled it off. So believe me right off the bat when I say that I'm very impressed with my mother. However, she raised me to be very quote-unquote polite, meaning that you're never supposed to talk about two things in particular. We've all heard it before. You should never talk about religion, and you should never talk about politics. So I find it really ironic now that in my adult life, my career seems to have been founded around being, I guess, the rudest person in the room, because I have no problem at all talking about religion or politics. But the question is, how can we talk about these topics in a way that it's a conversation, that it's conducive to creating an actual outcome or an objective, or even more importantly, an actual compromise, which is what we really need to be looking for in a lot of ways, is how can we truly learn to be in the same room with different opinions but still get along. And what I've often noticed is that a lot of times all you have to do is bring up certain elements and people will shut down. So a lot of times what I've found is how we produce it, how we present it, can often be a lot more important than what the topic itself is, or even the conversational piece. Because on that same note, if we're never supposed to talk about religion or politics, what are the two most aggressively fought over categories in society today? Religion and politics. And I do not believe for an instant that the main reason it is so controversial in our society today is because for generations ahead, we were just told never to talk about it. Meaning that for generations, everyone just kind of did what they wanted to. They didn't care what the other person thought, and when the other person then turned around and said, I don't like it, they immediately got shut down by a controversy because it's rude to do it. But that's just not how society is supposed to function. Society is supposed to be a group of people actually living together even when we can't get along. And we still have to be able to coexist correctly. But that also means that there are certain ways where we're going to get what we want and there's other times where we won't. And it seems today that most of the time, either side of any argument today really feels like the second they're not getting their way, that their rights are being trampled on somehow, and that the other person is an oppressor. And that's not always the case. Sometimes it's just that they don't agree with you. And there's nothing wrong with disagreements, but we have to be willing to discuss it. So when we think about language, language is so vitally important. And it's a very simple context why. We actually think in language. You see, as we think about things, we do it within a language. If you're from Germany, then as you're thinking about the events that come up, you're using German words, German context, to put those thoughts into action. Same thing with if you're from England, because we can all speak English and still have different dialects. If someone's from England versus someone from the United States, or say someone from South Africa or Australia, see, all of these countries speak English. But when you put all four of those people into a room, they're going to have a little bit of an issue communicating clearly, because not all the things always mean the same thing to everyone else, but whatever it means to them, how they think of it and view it, is exactly how they mean it. And a lot of times our words, as we start communicating with other people, can become the problem that creates a distance and an actual barrier between reaching an agreement or a compromise that can actually allow for good how to move forward correctly without hurting each other too much. Someone at one point or another, if there's a compromise, each side is going to have a little bit where they didn't necessarily get everything they wanted. And if they did, they'll feel a large sense of pride, but it's completely at the expense of the other person. And the other person's going to feel they were cheated, robbed, and that their rights were infringed upon. So we have to really learn how to just communicate correctly with our language before we can even start addressing our different viewpoints. Now, I want to point out, caveat here, I am not a language expert. In fact, I screw up with my words quite a bit. So even though I'm going to be explaining a lot of the context of my viewpoints on this, please understand, I'm just as guilty of this as anyone else. So it's not a perfect science. It's just one of those things that we can use as a guideline to help drive us towards a better communication with individuals so that they can see things our way. And more importantly, we then have to turn around and be willing and to listen to theirs. Because a lot of times what we want to do is we want to make sure that we got our viewpoint around correctly. But if they're not willing to listen, they're not going to hear it anyway. And on the same note, the first way you can get someone to listen to you is to first shut up and listen to them. And that is not always easy, because we already know that whatever they're trying to say usually is going to tick us off. But we have to be willing to put that aside, listen to what they're saying, ask questions of why are they saying it, where are they coming from, what's the viewpoint that's driving it. And then after we've heard their say, if we turn around and we say, well, I'd like to offer a different opinion, you would be surprised how willing people are to listen, because you listened first. So the most important thing to remember about language in general, right off the bat with communication, and this gets hit on in a lot of different places throughout my work, is that listening is the first stage of communication. We have to be willing to listen. Okay? But what I want to dive into specifically today is actually the use of bad language. When we say offensive language, or cursing words, or cussing words. You see, the words themselves as language is something I want to dive into a little bit. But the first stage, the first part that I wanted to make sure we got across was that the point of language is that, one, we think in language, but we don't always think in the same dialect. We don't always think in the same word usage as everyone else. So sometimes we have to be willing to be very precise and even a little bit outside of our own comfort zone to make sure that we can communicate clearly with them if that's what we're really trying to do. And the second thing is that we always have to remember, before someone's going to listen to us, we need to be willing to listen to them. And it is not easy to do that, especially when it comes to topics that are going to be controversial. But I truly believe any topic that is controversial has to be approached from a dialect and a communication standpoint that is going to allow for reaching a compromise, because compromise is what literally drives society. Now, don't get me wrong. If you listen to some of my other work, there are some things that are just hard lines in the sand, and For example, I refuse to yield on certain elements. For me, there's no compromise in certain areas. Like when someone says that everything's a matter of perspective, no, it's not. I simply draw the line in the sand right there and say, not everything is a matter of perspective, but I will say that your perspective matters because it drives your decisions. But if you think that everything is open to interpretation, you're already wrong and you're going down a self-destructive path. And that's why I fight against that one wholeheartedly. But where there's other areas, I think we should be able to compromise. And that is the key element of using language correctly. But today, I want to go into cursing, offensive language, bad words. So when we come back, that's what we're going to jump into. It's actually quite comical. You're going to love it. Please don't forget to follow and review the show today. Also, head over and register at the chrisfwalker.com website. There you'll find links to the Indiegogo and Patreon campaigns, which help keep this show going. You'll also find links to the bookstore, gear shop, blog, and you'll stay up to date on upcoming events and live appearances. Now, let's get back to today's message. And welcome back. Thank you so much again for joining me. Today, we're talking about bad language. And when we think about bad words, usually there's a few of them that jump right into our head. But the problem with bad words, with bad language, with offensive language, is that it can be open to interpretation for a lot of different people. And I want to share an example of a legitimate time that occurred in my life where I got to experience this firsthand and then kind of give you a context of where I'm going with it. See, I come out of a military background. Now, anybody who's been in the military will tell you there are some words that are thrown around pretty freely in the military that in a lot of cases you would never say in church or maybe at a nice dinner party. There are certain words that are just acceptable in some contexts and not acceptable in others. But a lot of times when we're afraid to use language in a way that can help us relate, oftentimes what that does is it creates a barrier. Now, don't get me wrong. I want to make sure that this caveat is thrown out there right here. You should never have to use a word you are not comfortable with. There is no reason at all any word coming out of your mouth should ever be something that causes you anxiety or distress. You should always be able to use the words coming out of your mouth in a way that's not only authoritative about your viewpoints, but also loving, kind, and usually, I always like to throw in a little bit of humor. So I want to share with you an example. I was actually doing a mission where I was reaching out to some individuals who were in a correctional facility. And I was inside of the facility. We had about 30 gentlemen in that room. They were all males. And I know that in the context of the audience, a lot of them probably were used to seeing or hearing vulgar style language. And when I was up there originally giving the presentation, I was trying to make my point very clear. But what I noticed as I looked around in the audience was a lot of laid back in their chair, arms folded, heads down. There was a lot of skepticism within the room. People did not really believe what I was saying right now. They felt there was a distance. They could not hear that what I was saying was something that pertained and gave them information that they could use. Instead, what they were viewing was the way that I was presenting it was creating a barrier, and they didn't want to hear it just because of the way I was presenting it. And I realized it. So mid-sentence, I actually stopped in the middle of the presentation, looked around, stood there for silence for just a little bit so that I could kind of get their attention again. Sometimes silence is a very, very useful tool if you're doing public speaking, by the way. But as I stood there silently looking around the room, I finally just threw out about half a dozen words that would be considered inappropriate in most settings, back to back to back, just rattled them all off. And I just blah, 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 blah. If we had that bleeping tool, it would be bleep, 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 bleep. That's kind of what it sounded like. Now, when I looked back into the audience now, all of them perked up just because of everything I had said. And I said, gentlemen, I want you guys to understand. I don't come from a background of perfect. I come from a background of very imperfect. And I've had to endure a lot of hardships. And I've also been through some very serious trials in my life. And what I'm talking about today with you here are a lot of very, very useful points of information that I'm really hoping you'll be able to understand. They can help you in a lot of the areas you may have been struggling. But you have to first realize I'm just as human as you are. I come from a lot of similar backgrounds you guys do. And the reality is I am just as imperfect as the rest of you guys. Because I was able to throw out a lot of different words that they would they know would be considered offensive to most people. But just because I was willing to use them in their context correctly and throw them out there just like it was a regular conversation, the air in that room changed instantly. Everybody perked up. They all wanted to know what I had to say now. And they started asking questions. And the reason why was because up until now, I was not someone they could relate to. Because I wasn't even using language that they understood. Now, don't get me wrong. Throughout the rest of that presentation, I might have let one or two, bad ones fly, but I didn't do it on purpose in that context. It was just okay, I know that this is the language they want to hear. This is the language they're comfortable with. This is the language they're used to. Now, that doesn't mean that I like it, but I'm not offended by it because I've been around it quite a bit. And more importantly, I know that for them, it's a barrier that must be overcome if they're going to understand I'm not talking about the language part of this, I'm talking about the context part of this. And they weren't hearing the context because of the language. So you have to be able to bridge gaps. And that's ultimately what bad language is doing. Good or bad, what a bad language barrier does is it prevents communication. Doesn't matter how clear you're making your point. If they don't like the words you're using, they don't hear it. So in some cases, don't get me wrong, I love being a Christian. I love being able to go on Christian radio. I love being able to do public speaking in Christian environments. So trust me, I do not find a lot of the words that are used in common language today to be very genteel or sincere. But I do, however, realize that a lot of other people do. So because I've used them before in my past, because I understand their context, when I'm in this certain environment, it doesn't necessarily offend me to have to throw it around a little bit or to hear it. In fact, I don't mind how they present their argument, so long as I can hear their message, because I'm willing to look past their words. So I wanted to share with you a fun example. There is a word that in particular everybody considers to be bad. And I wanted to say, this is an example of bad or cursing or everything else, is that we don't even understand the word itself. Now, this word is spelled S-H-I-T. And for the sake of viewers everywhere, I obviously don't want to just say it out loud because some people would find it offensive. But we all know what that word is, right? Now, what's interesting is a lot of us don't even know where that word comes from, because it's actually not even a word. It's actually an acronym. It is a word that was put together off of a hazmat label. And let me explain that. You see, in the old days, as the English colonies were starting to grow here in the United States, they didn't have a whole lot of fresh farmland, but there was a lot of wood. There was a lot of trees. So what ended up happening was they were cutting down a lot of trees, and they were shipping back lumber to help build a lot of the Navy for the English. And another thing they were doing is they were using a lot of that lumber as fuel for their fires so they could create tar. And there was a big push for a lot of those kinds of elements within the United States. That's actually, and glass makers too. There's a lot of wood that's required for the glass furnaces. And so a lot of those kinds of industries were the first things that came to the United States, started chopping down all the trees so that they could use them for these particular types of industry. And what it left them with was a lot of farmland. After they removed the stumps, they could actually farm, but they had no fertilizer because it had never been farmed before. So what they started doing was they started transporting the livestock and also a lot of the livestock excrement because that serves as a fertilizer. So they would ship it overseas back here to the United States. Now, interesting things about manure is it has a lot of the same properties as hay does. And anybody who's ever been on a farm knows that when you throw a big haystack, what happens is as the hay starts decomposing, it starts generating heat. Now, the heat that is generated usually comes from within because that's where the pressure is from all the weight of the hay pressing down on itself while it's decomposing. So it actually gets hotter the more that you go into the haystack. And the other thing that's interesting about it is it starts drying out the outside layers of the stack because of the heat. So what you have is you have an extremely flammable material that is surrounding a heat source. And it was actually not uncommon for large shipments of manure to go through this process, and within a few weeks, which means they'd be right about the middle of the Atlantic, the wood would catch fire in those shipping crates. and now you have a fire on a boat that is wooden with cloth sails in the middle of the Atlantic. Probably not the best thing for the morale of the crew. So what's interesting is that they started creating different ways to ship it. They started creating literal hazmat laws about how to ship fertilizer. So, for example, you could put only a certain amount of fertilizer into little small containers. Now, those small containers could be contained into a big container, as many as you wanted, so long as there was something to separate them so that they could not generate enough heat among themselves to actually create combustion. And the other thing that was interesting was they started labeling the crates ship high in transit. What they were telling the people at the docks was, this is loaded with a fertilizer. It has the potential to be flammable, so do not put it in the bottom of the cargo hold, because if it catches fire, the whole ship is going to go up. Instead, they would ship it high in transit. It would be high on the boat, sometimes even all the way on the deck, depending on how the ship was actually transporting. But the idea was that if it did catch fire, they could put the fire out quickly, and if not, they could ditch it out the boat into the Atlantic so that the whole ship didn't go up. So, believe it or not, the acronym SHIT stands for Ship High in Transit. And what it was referring to was the hazmat material that's inside, which was poop. Well, as people started seeing this at the docks and then, common language throughout the naval world, it started, the old saying that, cussing like a sailor, they started it there. Sailors have always kind of had a rough language to them. But what they started adopting was the acronym SHIT. And then they would start saying that what was inside those crates might also be what's inside your head. And that's where we'd get, blank for brains, or you're full of blank. And the reason that this context worked was because they knew what was inside the crates. They were referring to poop. And so when it comes to bad words, it's not necessarily the word that's bad. But on that same note, I do want to talk really quick about offensive language, because when we use our words offensively, that's where we're actually causing offense to someone else on purpose. That is also offensive language, regardless of the words you use. So for example, when you turn around and you tell someone, "Man, that was stupid," they might take offense to that, but it's still true. If it was a completely stupid thing to do, then it's a true statement, and it did not attack them, it attacked their actions. Now, on that same note, if I turn around and I say, "You're stupid," there's a difference. Because now I'm attacking you in person, I'm attacking you directly, I'm attacking you as an individual. And that's not appropriate. We really should not do that to each other. Does that mean we do and don't do it? Look, I'm guilty too. We all have those moments of, "That son of a," and we just don't want to take it back, but we have to learn to be in a lot of more control of our tongues, because words and language create such a huge barrier for people being willing to listen to us. So what I'm hoping you're getting out of this today is that words are not the point. The content is the point. But that doesn't mean you have free reign to use whatever words you want. If you're causing offense to someone, you really still should not be doing it. Again, for example, I don't mind using some words around an environment of, say, military soldiers. If I'm in a whole bunch of my peers, we all came out of the Army, we all know the language that we used. It doesn't offend me and it doesn't offend them. Most of the time. But, again, maybe there is someone in there who does take offense. And if so, just don't do it. Just don't use it. So, it's not about the language itself. It's about what offense are you causing. And more importantly, are you creating a barrier that is preventing communication? Because communication is what's ultimately needed. And yes, it involves even things like religion and politics. I realize your time is the most precious commodity you could possibly share with anyone. So I want to thank you again for spending some of yours here with me today. Don't forget to review the message for others. And be sure to follow the Chris F. Walker podcast for new releases. Remember, your generous support on sites like Indiegogo and Patreon are making this show possible. Don't forget to register at the chrisfwalker.com website for links to the bookstore, gear shop, and to stay updated for new events and appearances. I hope to see you again soon. God bless.